In March of 2004, four high school friends on spring break in Florida vanished after a late-night drive along the coastal highway. Authorities quickly suggested the teens had drowned after reckless partying, but not a single body, car, or trace of wreckage was ever found. For 5 long years, families were left with silence, until a group of fishermen casting nets along a coral reef dragged up something chilling, a piece of twisted metal with a license plate still clinging to it. And inside, the seats told a darker story. The night was heavy with heat, the kind of thick, humid air that clung to every surface along Florida's Atlantic coast. Neon signs flickered above crowded boardwalk bars, laughter spilled into the streets, and the sound of waves pounded rhythmically in the background, a reminder that the ocean was always just beyond reach. For four high school friends, this was the night they had been waiting for, their first taste of freedom before graduation. A spring break that was supposed to be filled with nothing more dangerous than cheap beer and bad decisions. Instead, it would become the last night anyone saw them alive. They were ordinary teenagers, the kind you might pass by without a second glance. Ryan, the quiet leader with a cautious streak he never quite lived up to. Miguel, quick-witted and restless, always pushing for one more dare. Chelsea, shy but radiant in the glow of her friends, reluctant yet drawn to the energy around her, and Jenna, the loudest of the group, the one who could talk her way into or out of anything. Together they made a picture of youth on the brink of adulthood, a fragile moment caught between childhood innocence and the weight of what was coming next. On that humid March night in 2004, they climbed into Ryan's aging Honda Civic, its paint sun-faded and the back bumper rattling just enough to make them laugh. A witness outside the Boardwalk Arcade recalled the group spilling into the parking lot just after midnight. They were all smiles, the man would later tell investigators, his memory sharp even years later. The girls had their sandals in their hands, like they'd just come from the beach. The boys were joking, kind of shoving each other, you know. Normal kids. Inside the car, the air smelled faintly of salt water and coconut sunscreen. Miguel leaned out the passenger window, shouting at a group of strangers on the sidewalk, his voice swallowed by music blasting from somewhere down the strip. Chelsea, sitting behind him, pressed her forehead against the cool glass, her hair damp from the ocean. "Let's just go back," she murmured. Ryan shook his head, hands gripping the wheel. "One more drive, then we'll head in." The car pulled away, its taillights glowing red against the wet asphalt before fading into the night. No one followed. No one thought to mark the moment. But that decision, one last drive, would soon become the detail burned into every retelling of their story. The last confirmed sighting came from a waitress at a roadside diner 2 miles down Highway A1A. She remembered them laughing, Miguel teasing Jenna about the way she stirred her milkshake. They looked like they belonged in a photograph, she said, like kids who thought the night would never end. By 12:45 a.m. they were gone, swallowed by the endless dark stretch of road that hugged the shoreline. Later, investigators would retrace the route, noting the sharp turns, the crumbling edges where the highway narrowed dangerously close to the ocean. The Atlantic was a living, breathing predator, black water surging just feet from the pavement. One wrong move, and a car could disappear beneath the waves without leaving a trace. That theory, simple and almost comforting in its logic, would become the official explanation. But that night, there were no tire marks, no guardrail damage, no sign of a car plunging into the sea, just silence. At 1:03 a.m., Jenna's phone pinged a cell tower near Cape Canaveral. It would be the last signal any of their devices ever made. The car was already off-grid, already unreachable. The boardwalk lights dimmed with the hour, crowds thinned, the sound of waves filling the vacuum where laughter had been. Somewhere beyond the dunes, Ryan's Civic rolled steadily down the empty highway, headlights sweeping across palm trees and cracked asphalt. The friends inside were still laughing, still certain they had more night ahead of them. But by sunrise, not a single one of them would ever be seen alive again. The first light of dawn should have brought the comfort of routine. Coffee brewing in quiet kitchens, the rustle of newspapers, the sound of teenagers sleeping in far too late. Instead, it carried silence. Phones rang unanswered, beds lay untouched, and 4 families woke to the creeping dread that something was terribly, irreversibly wrong. By 9 a.m. the parents were already calling each other, their voices jagged with confusion. Had anyone heard from them? Did they come home? Ryan's mother clutched the cordless phone so tightly her knuckles whitened, her eyes fixed on the driveway where her son's car should have been. He always checks in, she muttered, as if saying it aloud could undo the hours of silence. Chelsea's father dialed her cell again and again, pressing the phone to his ear, only to hear the same hollow message. "The number you are trying to reach is unavailable." He slammed the phone onto the counter. "Unreachable," he whispered. "How the hell is she unreachable?" The first calls to police were met with practiced calm. "They're probably out late, maybe slept at a friend's place," one dispatcher told Miguel's mother. She pressed the phone tighter against her ear. "No," she said, her voice breaking. "That's not my son. He would have called me." As hours stretched into the afternoon, panic replaced patience. Parents gathered in each other's homes, flipping through yearbooks and photos as if the images themselves could conjure their children back. Conversations turned frantic, overlapping, full of desperate logic. Ryan wouldn't drive drunk. Chelsea can't swim. She avoids the ocean. Jenna hates the dark. She'd never just disappear like this. By evening, detectives finally arrived, their clipped voices sharp against the thrum of ceiling fans and restless pacing. Theories came quickly, too quickly, spoken almost like reassurances. Maybe the teens had been drinking, maybe they took a turn too fast on the coastal highway, maybe the ocean swallowed their car whole. Miguel's father slammed a fist on the table. "Then where are they? Where are the bodies?" His words cut the room into silence. The detectives shifted uncomfortably, the weight of his question leaving them nothing to offer but vague promises of search efforts. That night, the parents did what parents do when the world has collapsed. They called. Over and over, each ring met with absence. Ryan's sister whispered into her brother's voicemail, her voice trembling, "Just tell me you're okay, please." Chelsea's mother sat at the edge of her bed, staring at her daughter's backpack slumped in the corner, untouched. Sometime past midnight, as the storm of unanswered calls and unsteady hope carried on, Jenna's mother scrolled through her call log one last time. That's when she saw it. A missed call, marked 1:47 a.m. Her heart hammered as she pressed play. The message was short, distorted, barely more than static and muffled breathing, but beneath the crackle, a girl's voice whispered just two words, fragile and terrifying. "Help me." The ocean was gray that morning, restless under a shifting sky. As the first boats set out to search, engines groaned against the tide, while the families stood at the shoreline, their eyes fixed on the horizon. Salt hung heavy in the air, mingling with the smell of fuel and fear. Somewhere beyond the breakers, they believed, lay the truth about their children. By mid-morning, the Coast Guard had deployed helicopters, their blades chopping through the humid air as spotters leaned from open doors, scanning the coastline. From above, the Atlantic looked endless. A quilt of black-green waves, swelling and collapsing, hiding whatever secrets it had claimed during the night. If they went into the water, the ocean would take them fast, one officer admitted quietly. His words were meant for a colleague, but a mother overheard. Her knees buckled. On land, volunteers scoured every patch of beach, every trail of mangroves and dunes. Shoes sank into wet sand as they called the teens' names into the wind. The sound carried, then vanished into the roar of the surf. Plastic bags and driftwood littered the shore. But nothing that belonged to Ryan, Miguel, Chelsea, or Jenna. Not a shoe, not a phone, not even a scrap of fabric. Divers slipped beneath the surface in pairs, their flashlights cutting through the murk. Down there, time slowed. Every exhale bubbled upward in silver streams, the only sound in the crushing silence of the deep. They combed along coral ridges and sandy drop-offs where the seafloor disappeared into blackness. Hours stretched into days, yet nothing emerged from the water except seaweed and broken shells. It was like searching a graveyard without headstones, one diver later said. Back on shore, whispers began. Some said the teens had run away, chasing some secret plan of freedom. Others muttered about abduction, drug runners along the coast, or worse, that the kids had gotten tangled up in something they shouldn't have. Rumors spread faster than the search itself, each one carving a deeper wound into the families who clung to hope. At a press conference, police repeated the same theory: the teens likely drove off the highway and into the ocean. The tide can sweep away evidence in minutes, a sergeant said firmly. Yet behind closed doors, even investigators admitted the puzzle didn't fit. There were no skid marks, no broken guardrail, no trace of impact. 4 people, a car, an entire night, simply erased. As dusk fell on the 3rd day, a fisherman anchored just off the reef squinted into the distance. The sun was sinking, the sea glowing orange and red. When he saw it, faint beams beneath the waves, like headlights struggling against the dark. He rubbed his eyes, unsure if it was exhaustion or something real. The lights flickered once more, then vanished beneath the tide. Hope has a way of mutating in the face of silence. When days turned into weeks with no trace of the missing friends, families clung to whispers, rumors, anything that might suggest their children were still alive. The absence of bodies, the absence of wreckage, it all seemed to leave room for possibility. And that possibility became fuel. The first anonymous tip came 2 weeks after the disappearance. A man in Miami swore he had seen the teens walking along Ocean Drive, backpacks slung over their shoulders, blending into the neon tide of tourists. "I'm sure of it," he told police, his voice insistent. The tall boy, the blonde girl, they looked tired but alive. Detectives followed the lead, interviewing store clerks and pulling surveillance footage. Nothing matched. No faces, no car, no trace, just another dead end. Then came whispers from across the border. A call placed to the sheriff's office claimed the teens had been spotted in Mexico, hitchhiking south with strangers. They didn't look scared, the caller said. They looked like they were running toward something. For a moment, the families felt a jolt of hope. Maybe they hadn't drowned at all. Maybe this was a reckless escape. A terrible but survivable truth. Investigators contacted Border Patrol, traced bus tickets, even combed through hostel registries. Again, nothing. The rumor evaporated, leaving behind only the sting of disappointment. Inside the precinct, detectives debated how far to stretch their resources. "Every call we chase means pulling people off the water search," one officer muttered, thumbing through a stack of leads scribbled on yellow paper. Another, more weary, replied, "But what if this is the one? What if we ignore it and it turns out to be real?" It was a cruel equation, balancing scarce manpower against desperate families, knowing each false lead carried its own form of damage. As months passed, the theories grew stranger. Some said the friends had been abducted by traffickers, others believed they were hiding, witnesses to something they weren't supposed to see. Every phone call to the sheriff's office was logged, every sighting checked, every story collapsed under scrutiny. Nothing held. The families began to resent this cycle, hope flaring, only to be extinguished again. Chelsea's mother summed it up in one exhausted breath during an interview. "They keep telling us they drowned, but if that's true, why does everyone keep seeing them?" Her words hung heavy in the room, a mixture of faith and frustration, the impossible duality of hope in the face of loss. 5 months after that first night, when the story had begun to fade from headlines, a beachcomber stumbled across a wallet half buried in the sand. Weathered leather, soaked through with salt, police rushed to the scene, families standing behind the yellow tape, breath held. An officer pulled the ID free, squinting against the sunlight. It wasn't theirs, not Ryan's, not Miguel's, not Chelsea's, not Jenna's, just another stranger, another dead end. And the ocean, once again, kept its silence. Grief can hollow a person, but obsession can keep them moving long after everyone else has collapsed. For Miguel's father, Daniel Alvarez, silence was not an answer, and 5 months of fruitless searching had not dulled his determination. While other families began to retreat into themselves, weighed down by exhaustion, Daniel leaned into the fire. He could not rest, not while the ocean continued to hold its secrets. He was not a man of wealth or connections, but desperation has its own kind of currency. Daniel sold his fishing boat, the one his father had given him years earlier, and poured the money into hiring private divers. "If the police won't find them, then I will," he told his wife one night, voice sharp, eyes fixed on the tide creeping against the seawall. She wept quietly in the kitchen, the sound of her sobs mixing with the steady hum of the refrigerator. "You can't keep doing this," she whispered. "You're losing yourself." The divers he hired came from Miami, men hardened by years of salvage operations and storm recoveries. They arrived with scarred equipment and eyes that betrayed both confidence and caution. Daniel watched them prepare on the docks, his hands trembling as he handed over maps of the reef, the crude circles he'd drawn where the fishermen had claimed to see headlights months earlier. "Here," he said, jabbing the paper with a finger. "It's here, you'll see." Beneath the waves, the divers described a world both alien and hostile. Currents pushed them sideways, visibility shrank to a murky few feet, and the coral loomed like jagged ruins. Still, they pushed forward. One diver later recalled surfacing, ripping off his mask, and seeing Daniel waiting on the deck. Eyes wide, not asking if they were safe, but demanding only, "Did you find it?" In an interview years later, the diver said, "He didn't care about us. He cared about his boy. And I don't blame him." But obsession has a way of eating through the foundations of family. Daniel's marriage frayed under the strain. His wife pleaded with him to stop, to grieve in silence like the others. "We have a daughter still here," she argued. "You're forgetting," Daniel snapped back. "How can I think of anything else when my son is out there waiting to be found?" Their home filled with arguments that ended in slammed doors and silence. Neighbors began to whisper. Some pitied him, others muttered that he was delusional, chasing ghosts in waters that would never give up their dead, but Daniel did not bend. Night after night, he stood at the shore, staring into the dark expanse, his face weathered by wind and salt. He carried Miguel's baseball cap in his jacket pocket, thumbing the brim like a talisman, muttering under his breath, "I'll find you, Micho. I'll bring you home." Then, during a late-season dive, one of the men surfaced with a tremor in his voice. They had seen something glinting deep among the coral, something metallic, wedged in a crevice beyond the drop-off. "Could have been wreckage," the diver said, water dripping from his beard, eyes locked on Daniel. "A car, maybe. Too far down to be sure." Daniel's heart seized. His mind raced through every detail of that night, every rumor, every official explanation. This was it, the first real hint of something tangible. But before another dive could be launched, the ocean turned violent. A storm system swept in, churning the water into chaos, waves slamming against the reef like fists. Visibility dropped to nothing. Diving there became impossible. Daniel stood on the pier in the driving rain, fists clenched, watching the sea erase the only lead he'd ever had. The divers promised to return when the weather cleared, but in his gut, Daniel knew the ocean was not done fighting him. Time is supposed to dull pain, but for the families of Ryan, Miguel, Chelsea, and Jenna, time only deepened the hollow. Days became months, and months hardened into years. Each one measured not by milestones but by absence. Empty bedrooms sat like mausoleums, posters curling at the edges, trophies collecting dust. Birthdays came and went with candles unlit, chairs left vacant at holiday tables. The silence was not peaceful. It was suffocating. By the second year, the search efforts had dwindled. The Coast Guard stopped running patrols. Volunteers no longer gathered at the shoreline. Newspapers moved on, their headlines replaced with fresher tragedies. But Daniel Alvarez did not move on. Miguel's father continued to walk the shoreline every morning before dawn, scanning the tide for anything the sea might return. Some days he picked up nothing but driftwood. Other days he held scraps of seaweed as if they were evidence, his eyes glazed with determination. The other parents grieved in different ways. Ryan's mother joined a support group, her words halting as she shared with strangers what she could not speak aloud at home. Chelsea's father stopped talking altogether, retreating into his workshop, hammering wood late into the night, each strike echoing like an unanswered question. Jenna's mother left her daughter's room untouched, the closet still full of clothes that would never be worn, the voicemail with those two haunting words, "Help me," replayed again and again, until the sound was carved into her mind. Yet even in silence, rumors refused to die. Online forums whispered theories, The kids had been taken by traffickers, or they'd run away together, or their deaths were staged to hide something darker. Anonymous posters claimed sightings. A girl resembling Jenna in a small Georgia town, a young man who looked like Ryan working in a Texas gas station. Each rumor clawed at the families, stirring up a cycle of hope and heartbreak all over again. The police still clung to their simple explanation. The ocean took them, one detective told a local reporter. That stretch of highway is unforgiving. They veered off, and the sea did the rest. It was an answer built on absence, not evidence. Daniel spat when he read the article. If that's true, he muttered to himself, then where are they? Where's the car? His obsession had not cooled. If anything, the years sharpened it into something harder, more unyielding. By the 5th year, even the town itself seemed haunted by the memory. Teenagers whispered about the vanishing when they drove the coastal highway at night, headlights sweeping the same turns where the 4 friends were last seen. Some claimed to see shadows moving along the dunes. Others swore they heard laughter in the wind. The legend of the vanished spring breakers grew larger than the truth itself, a ghost story told at bonfires. Then, in the summer of 2009, storms rolled across the Atlantic. The waves pounded the reef for days, reshaping sandbars and tearing away coral that had clung stubbornly for years. Fishermen, returning to familiar waters once the skies cleared, noticed something different. Rocks had shifted, currents cut new paths, and pieces of debris that had never been visible before now jutted out from the reef like bones exposed after a landslide. One fisherman, casting his nets in the shallow edge of the reef, saw it first. A glimmer of rust, something angular wedged in the coral where there should have been only stone. He pulled closer, leaning over the side of his boat as the sun sank low. At first, he thought it was just a scrap of metal torn loose by the storm. But as he reached down with his gaff hook, the shape resolved into something more chilling. It wasn't natural. It wasn't random. It looked like the corner of a car door. The ocean, after 5 years of silence, had finally begun to speak. The sea was calm. The morning the fishermen pulled up their nets, but there was a weight in the water they had never felt before. The Atlantic, usually restless and wild, seemed to hold its breath. Salt air stung their faces. Gulls wheeled overhead, and the nets dragged with unnatural resistance. At first they cursed it, tangled coral, they thought, or heavy debris left behind by the storm. But when they strained against the lines, the surface broke with a screech of metal, and the ocean began to give up its secret. The object breached like some wounded animal, twisted steel dripping with seaweed, barnacles clinging to every edge. One of the fishermen dropped his cigarette straight into the water when he saw the shape emerge. It wasn't random wreckage. The square edges, the faded paint beneath the growth, the silhouette of a frame. A car. The men stood frozen, gripping the rails of their boat as the sunlight glinted off the corroded surface. "Holy God," one whispered, his voice trembling. The nets strained, creaking under the they pulled harder, salt water pouring off the wreck as it rose higher, the smell of rust and decay thick in the air. Then they saw it, a license plate, battered but still legible through the crust of coral and salt. 4 numbers, 2 letters, a combination burned into the minds of the missing families for 5 years. It was Ryan's Honda. The men called the Coast Guard immediately, voices panicked and disbelieving. "We've found it," one shouted over the radio. "We've found the damn car." Within hours, the scene was crawling with boats, divers, and law enforcement, their lights flashing red and blue across the water. Families rushed to the docks, faces pale, hope and dread colliding in their eyes. For 5 years, they had begged for proof. Now proof sat dripping and broken on the deck of a fishing boat. When the divers descended to the reef, they confirmed what the fishermen already feared. The car was wedged into the coral as if swallowed whole and pinned there by the ocean itself. Pulling it free would take hours. Piece by piece, they worked until the mangled Civic was lifted, tilted, and finally hauled onto the salvage barge. Reporters circled like vultures, their cameras aimed at the dripping wreck. The families were kept back as investigators pried open the rusted doors. Inside, the car was a tomb. Seaweed carpeted the seats. Fish darted in the shallow pools that had collected. A single sneaker floated out with the tidwater, caught and snagged on the metal frame. But when the wreck was fully opened, a sickening revelation came. 3 of the seats were empty. For 5 years, the official theory had been that all 4 teenagers had plunged into the sea together, that they had drowned in a single tragic instant. But now, staring into the cavernous, gutted car, investigators realized something far stranger. Only 1 seat showed signs of remains, partial, degraded, impossible to identify at first glance. The others were vacant, their seatbelts hanging limp, swaying with the motion of the boat. Daniel Alvarez pushed past the officers, screaming his son's name. Ryan's mother collapsed, her sobs tearing through the crowd. Chelsea's father clenched his fists, whispering over and over, "Where are they? Where are they?" The sea had finally answered their prayers, but the answer was more terrifying than the silence had ever been. The car sat under floodlights on the salvage lot, dripping seawater onto the concrete. Investigators moved slowly around it, their flashlights tracing every dent, every jagged tear of rusted steel. 5 years beneath the Atlantic had stripped it of color, leaving only a husk, but inside this husk lay the possibility of answers. Families stood beyond the barricades, straining to glimpse what the ocean had hidden for so long. Forensics technicians pried open doors that groaned like coffins. They laid out what they found piece by piece: fragments of fabric, seaweed woven into the upholstery, a cracked cell phone beyond repair, a sneaker swollen with water, and then the most haunting of all, partial remains, entangled in the driver's seat. Bones softened by years of salt water, impossible to identify without testing. The sight froze everyone in place. An officer whispered to another, "After 5 years, this is all that's left." Forensic anthropologists were called in, their gloved hands delicate as they collected what little the ocean had spared. DNA testing would take weeks, maybe months. Until then, the families were left with nothing but questions, and those questions multiplied as investigators dug deeper into the car itself. The first anomaly was the seatbelts. They hung loose, not frayed by salt water as expected, but cleanly cut. Each one bore the same diagonal slice, as if a blade had been drawn across them with deliberate force. The discovery unsettled even the most seasoned officers. "An accident doesn't cut seatbelts," one detective muttered. "Someone did this." The second anomaly was the positioning of the driver's seat. It had been pushed forward too far for Ryan, who was tall, to have driven comfortably. A detail small enough to be overlooked, but glaring to a mother who knew her son's habits. "He always kept it back," she told investigators firmly. "He hated being cramped." The implication was chilling. Someone else may have been behind the wheel. As word spread, the simple narrative of a tragic accident began to unravel. The press latched onto theories. Had the friends been forced off the road? Had they been driven into the water against their will? Police tried to temper speculation, but the cut seat belts were impossible to explain away. Daniel Alvarez, his voice hoarse, confronted the lead investigator outside the lot. "Tell me straight," he demanded. "Did someone kill my boy?" The detective hesitated, eyes darting away before replying. "We don't know yet, but it doesn't look right." Theories began to swirl again, but this time they carried sharper edges. Foul play was no longer just a rumor, it was a possibility supported by evidence. Some believed the teens had been victims of a carjacking gone wrong. Others suspected they had stumbled into something darker, something that left their car at the bottom of the sea, while 3 of them remained unaccounted for. And then there was the haunting detail no one could explain: the remains in the driver's seat. If the others had been cut free, where had they gone? Did they escape the car, only to vanish on land? Or had the ocean claimed them in a way no one had yet discovered? Investigators avoided eye contact when the families asked those questions. They had no answers, only the cold rattle of evidence bags and the metallic stink of salt-soaked steel. One technician, slipping his gloves off after a 14-hour day, put it quietly to a colleague. "The ocean gave us the car, but it didn't give us the truth." The discovery of the car should have been the end of the mystery, a grim confirmation of what police had insisted all along, but instead it unraveled everything. Cut seat belts, a driver's seat pushed forward, 3 missing bodies. These weren't the remnants of a simple accident, they were the ingredients of something darker. And as investigators struggled to interpret the evidence, the town's old whispers roared back to life. The first theory to resurface was the cartel. That stretch of Florida coast, locals reminded anyone who would listen, had long been a smuggling corridor. Drugs, money, even people were ferried across those waters under cover of night. They were kids in the wrong place at the wrong time, one retired detective said in a hushed interview. If they saw something they weren't supposed to, that's enough to make them vanish. His words carried a weight that sent chills through the family. Could their children have stumbled onto a deal in progress that night? Could the ocean have been a grave chosen by men who left nothing to chance? The second theory was more personal, a staged disappearance. The idea that the teens had chosen to vanish, to cut themselves free from their old lives, it seemed absurd to the families, who bristled at the suggestion. Chelsea was terrified of water. Her father snapped at a reporter, "You think she chose to disappear into the ocean? That's insane." But the rumor persisted, feeding on the absence of bodies, on the eerie voicemail that still hung like a ghost over the case. Detectives sat in cramped offices. The evidence spread across tables in messy stacks. Every theory falls apart, one investigator admitted late one night. If it was an accident, the seatbelts make no sense. If it was foul play, where are the others? And if they ran away, why leave behind the car? His partner rubbed his temples. It's like chasing smoke. But smoke has a way of clinging to old fire. During a second sweep of the reef, divers stumbled on something unexpected. Just 100 yards from where Ryan's Honda had been wedged, another shape lay hidden beneath coral and sand. Smaller, older, battered, beyond recognition. At first, they thought it was just debris from the storm. But when they brushed away the silt, the outline became undeniable. Another vehicle. The second car was hauled up under the same floodlights, dripping and corroded. Its frame was so mangled it barely resembled an automobile. But investigators found a VIN number still etched into the chassis. The records revealed a chilling truth. It had been reported stolen 3 years before the teens vanished. Inside, the car was empty, stripped of any remains. But the trunk told a different story. Heavy rope, frayed and waterlogged, coiled in the back like a nest. Scraps of duct tape, hardened and brittle, clung to the interior walls. Whatever had happened to this car, it had not been accidental. The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. Was this connected to the teens' disappearance? Or was it evidence of a separate crime the ocean had been hiding all along? For the families, the discovery only deepened the nightmare. Chelsea's mother wept when she heard the news. First their car, now another. "How many secrets does that water hold?" she asked, her voice trembling. And yet, no matter how unsettling the second car was, it provided no trace of the missing teenagers. No bodies, no belongings, no answers, just another grim artifact dredged from the deep. By the time investigators left the salvage yard that night, the weight of unanswered questions hung heavier than ever. One officer looked back at the 2 rusted shells sitting side by side under the harsh lights. "It's not just one mystery anymore," he said quietly. And maybe they're tied together. The ocean had given them more than they bargained for, but it had not yet given them the truth. When investigators revealed that 3 of the car's seats had been empty, a new and unsettling idea took hold. Maybe one of the teenagers had made it out alive. Maybe someone had escaped that watery grave, only to disappear into another kind of silence. It was Ryan's mother who first voiced what others had begun to whisper in secret. Sitting at her kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from her, she murmured, "What if one of them got out? What if they're still out there?" Her words were half prayer, half torment. Because if survival was possible, then so was abandonment. Psychologists brought in to consult on the case considered the idea carefully. "It's not uncommon," one explained. "In high-stress trauma, survivors can flee, even vanish themselves. Survivors' guilt can push someone to run as far and as fast as they can, to bury the past by burying themselves." The theory struck like a knife through the families. Could their children have escaped, only to choose silence over home? Detectives tried to ground the speculation in evidence. They combed through cell tower records again, revisiting the final ping from Jenna's phone near Cape Canaveral. They examined bank accounts, school files, passports. No trace of activity. It was as if all four had vanished in one breath. But the empty seats told another story. Someone, perhaps, had slipped free before the sea claimed them all. Daniel Alvarez seized onto the theory with desperation. He paced the shoreline, muttering, if one survived, it was Miguel. He was strong, he could have swum. He could have made it. His wife, exhausted by his hope, snapped back. If he survived, then why hasn't he come home? The question hung between them like a curse. The townspeople, too, began to murmur. Late at night in diners and bars, they spoke of a young man seen hitchhiking along the highway weeks after the disappearance. A drifter who refused to give his name. A girl who matched Chelsea's description spotted in Georgia, walking barefoot down a back road. Each sighting dissolved under scrutiny. But the whispers grew. And then there was the clue no one expected. During a dive along the reef, a volunteer diver found a single shoe wedged deep in the coral. It was waterlogged, the leather cracked, but intact. Investigators cataloged it carefully, cross-referencing with photos of the teens' belongings. But when the families were shown, the air left the room. The shoe didn't belong to any of the missing four. That detail shifted everything. If the car had been resting beside another wreck, if other crimes had been swallowed by the same ocean, then whose shoe was it? And did it mean the missing friends weren't alone in those waters? The lonely survivor theory held the families in a vise. To imagine one child alive was to imagine them suffering, hiding, perhaps even complicit. It was a hope laced with poison. One detective, staring at the shoe sealed in its evidence bag, put it bluntly, we're not just looking for bodies anymore. We might be looking for someone who walked away. What they found cracked open the story in ways no one expected. The first revelation came from Ryan's cell phone. Investigators discovered that while his device had stopped transmitting by 12:50 a.m., Jenna's phone had remained active for nearly 12 hours after the group vanished. The detail had been overlooked in the chaos of the initial investigation, buried beneath hundreds of pages of call logs. But now, illuminated by hindsight, it was devastating. Somewhere, somehow, Jenna's phone had continued to exist, powered on, alive in the network, long after the car had gone into the sea. The families seized on the discovery. Chelsea's mother pounded the table during a meeting with detectives. That means they weren't dead at 1 a.m., she cried. That means my daughter could have still been alive. Investigators tried to temper her hope. The signal did not prove location, only that the phone had not been destroyed. It could have been carried by someone else, turned on by another hand. But the uncertainty was its own torture. The second revelation came from a quiet corner of the forensic lab. Technicians examining the car's interior found microscopic traces of blood, not only on the driver's seat, where the remains had been recovered, but smeared faintly on the rear door. It was degraded beyond DNA analysis, but its presence hinted at violence before the crash. It wasn't clean, a technician admitted. Something happened in that car. Detectives began to wonder aloud if the teens had been forced off the road. Highway Patrol records revealed that stretch of A1A had been used before by smugglers evading police. If another vehicle boxed them in, ran them toward the shoulder, one officer suggested. The theory took shape like a shadow. Perhaps the friends had been victims of something larger, not recklessness, not choice, but an encounter that ended in deliberate silencing. Daniel Alvarez stood trembling, his fists clenched. 5 years, he shouted. 5 years of silence because you didn't do your job. His voice carried the weight of every sleepless night, every argument, every desperate prayer shouted into the tide. But even as the truth bent into view, it refused to settle into clarity. One set of remains, 3 missing, seatbelts cut, a phone that lingered alive, blood in the back seat. The ocean had given fragments, and fragments only. Still, the story shifted in the minds of those who followed it. This was no longer a tragedy of teenagers gone joyriding, lost to the waves. It was something colder, more deliberate. The shape of foul play loomed large, even if the hand that had caused it remained unseen. Late one night, as files were boxed and reboxed, one detective summed it up quietly to a colleague: "We don't have the who, we don't have the why, but we know one thing: they didn't just vanish. Someone made them vanish." Grief does not end with discovery. For the families of Ryan, Miguel, Chelsea, and Jenna, the recovery of the car and fragments of evidence only deepened the wound. Instead of closure, they were left with sharper questions, questions that cut into every part of their lives. The memorial service was held on a gray autumn afternoon. Clouds pressed low over the church, and rain streaked the windows like tears no one could hold back. The pews were filled with classmates who had grown older, moved on, yet carried the hollow ache of absence. 4 candles burned at the altar, their flames unsteady, as parents stepped forward one by one to speak the names of children whose futures had been stolen. Ryan's mother clutched the podium, her voice breaking. He should have been in college now. He should have been here. The silence after her words was heavier than sound. Daniel Alvarez sat apart, his face hardened, his hands gripping Miguel's baseball cap. He could not speak. His obsession had burned away words, leaving only the raw conviction that the truth was still buried out there, in the water or in someone's silence. His wife leaned against him, eyes closed, whispering, "Please, Daniel, please let him rest." But he could not. In the months that followed, the families fractured under the weight of not knowing. Chelsea's parents divorced quietly, unable to reconcile the grief that filled every corner of their home. Jenna's mother moved to another town, leaving her daughter's bedroom untouched, preserved like a shrine. Ryan's sister left for college, but returned often, drawn back to the shoreline where she had last seen her brother's car in the driveway. Each of them lived inside their own version of the tragedy, and none of them could escape it. The community, too, bore scars. Teenagers still whispered about the 4 who vanished, daring each other to drive the coastal highway late at night. Some said they saw headlights appear in the darkness, only to fade into the waves. Others swore they heard laughter carried on the wind. The legend of the vanished spring breakers twisted into ghost stories told around bonfires, but beneath the thrill, the fear was real. Parents warned their children not to drive that stretch after dark. The highway itself seemed cursed. The police, under pressure, eventually marked the case as unresolved. Officially, it remained a probable accident complicated by foul play. Unofficially, it was an open wound in the department, a reminder of mistakes made too early to undo. Retired officers confessed their regrets in interviews, voices thick with guilt. "We should have found them sooner," one admitted. "Maybe then we'd know the truth." For the families, grief became a cycle of hope and despair. The voicemail left on Jenna's phone was replayed countless times, its distorted whisper of "help me" both a dagger and a lifeline. It was the only direct echo of their children's voices from that night, and it haunted them in equal measure. Yet even in grief, there were moments of fragile remembrance. On the anniversary each year, classmates and neighbors gathered at the beach, setting lanterns adrift on the water. Flames flickered across the surface, hundreds of lights carried by the tide. For a few moments the ocean seemed gentle, almost forgiving. Then the lanterns drifted away, swallowed by the horizon. But the haunting never left. Late at night, Chelsea's father once stood at the shoreline, waves lapping at his shoes, and whispered into the dark, "Where are you?" The sea, as always, gave no reply. The aftermath was not healing. It was endurance. To live with absence, to carry unanswered questions, to exist in the shadow of a mystery that had no end. And yet, years later, when the ocean shifted again, it would reveal one final devastating secret. The ocean does not forget, even years after the car was lifted from the reef, even after the memorials faded and the families withdrew into silence, the Atlantic still held its secrets close. Fishermen whispered that the wreck was not the only one resting beneath those waves, that the reef was littered with rusting skeletons of vehicles and boats, a graveyard where stories ended but never explained themselves. The disappearance of Ryan, Miguel, Chelsea, and Jenna had already become more than a tragedy. It had become legend. Local teens dared each other to drive Highway A1A after midnight, headlights slicing through the same bends where the friends were last seen. Some swore they saw shadows moving along the shoulder, others claimed a phantom car appeared behind them, only to vanish when they turned to look. The highway became a ghost road, haunted not by spirits but by the weight of unanswered questions. For the families, the legacy was heavier. Grief had reshaped their lives, carving scars into marriages, friendships, and entire futures. Ryan's sister later said in an interview, "It's like living with a hole in the world. Everyone tells you to heal, but you can't heal when you don't know where the wound ends." Chelsea's father stopped giving interviews altogether, his silence louder than any words. Daniel Alvarez never let go of his search, even in age. Neighbors sometimes saw him standing at the seawall at dawn, staring out across the tide with Miguel's baseball cap still in his hands. His hair had turned white, but his obsession had not dimmed. The town itself changed too. Tourism slowed as the story spread, the coastal stretch branded in whispers as cursed. Documentaries, articles, and true crime forums dissected the case, turning the four friends into symbols of the inexplicable, a mystery that could not be solved, only retold. Strangers on the internet spun theories, some cruel, others desperate, each one another layer of distortion on lives once so ordinary. And still, the reef remained. Divers reported finding scraps of twisted metal years later, shards of the Civic that had broken away during recovery, fragments of paint, a door handle lodged in the coral. Each discovery was a reminder that the ocean had not surrendered everything, it never would. For those who lived through it, the legacy of the vanishing was not about headlines or theories. It was about the silence that lingered in their homes, the birthdays missed, the laughter that would never return. It was about 4 young lives cut short, preserved only in photographs and memories. And it was about a reef, just beyond the breakers, that still concealed more than it revealed. Standing at the shoreline, the waves rolling endless and indifferent, one could almost believe the sea was guarding something, a truth too heavy, too terrible to be released. Even now, pieces of that car, pieces of that night, remain trapped beneath the coral, and with them,